All right, thank you everybody. Good morning. So I've been working with OpenStreetMap quite a long time for work, for research, for personal interest. And so today I'm going to be talking about native reservations in OpenStreetMap, and this will be a little bit about what native reservations are, why they're important, but also how we go about the process of collaboratively editing the map on OpenStreetMap. And so before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge that we're gathered here on the traditional and ancestral lands of the Puyallup tribe, and here on the Salish Sea, the greater region is the traditional lands of the Coast Salish people who have been here for centuries, millennia, and everything we do is on their land. And we are also, as cartographers here, part of making maps, working with open data in this session. I'll be talking about OpenStreetMap, as Sam talked about in the Mapillary talk earlier this morning. And for those of you who don't know what OpenStreetMap is, it is basically a collaborative map of the world. Anyone can edit it, anyone can change a feature that you see on the map, you can add something, you can remove something. It's kind of like Wikipedia, but for maps. And so I live now in Bellingham, Washington. That's where I grew up. Just moved back there a few years ago. It's also on the traditional lands of the Lummi and the Nooksack people. And here in Bellingham, there is a fairly large native reservation right across the bay from us. And I was looking at OpenStreetMap sometime last year. I'm always looking for things to add and contribute to OpenStreetMap, and I saw our local reservation, our neighbors are not on this map. Great, this is something I'll find some open data that we can put into the map and I'll add it. So I opened up the JOSM editor, which is there's multiple tools you can use to edit the OpenStreetMap database. And as soon as I open it up, I see that the reservation actually already was there. You can ignore the fact that this is a very ugly map when you're editing OpenStreetMap. Some of the other tools are a little bit prettier, but this is the powerful tool that will let you see all the attributes and all the history. So I can see that it already exists. Somebody had already added all of these tags describing that it is a boundary that is Aboriginal lands boundary. They've linked it to the Wikipedia page. And the history, was already version 8 by the time I saw it, and it had been created over 8 years ago. So this has been in OpenStreetMap for a long time, but it's not been on OpenStreetMap. What does that mean? What's going on here? So the thing is, OpenStreetMap is really less of a map and it's more of a database. That's the fundamental thing that it is. It's a collaborative database, and there are many possible maps that could be made from it. But there is one map that lives on the OpenStreetMap website, which is kind of like the default map, and you kind of want to be on that. So in a moment, I'll come back to talking about how we can figure out what's going on, why is it in the database but not on the map. But in parallel to talking about that, I also want to talk about what it is that we're actually trying to map here. And I want to be really clear that I'm not really talking about mapping native land, because in a sense, this is all native land. I'm not really talking about indigenous mapping. I'm not really talking about mapping things from a native perspective. I'm not native, I'm not indigenous. It's not my place to speak about that. It's not my place to try to map those things. So really, I want to find a way to contribute meaningfully that is true to my perspective, and true to something that I feel like I can meaningfully contribute about. So strictly talking about this legal structure of Indian reservations, but of course in other countries they're called dozens of other things. Native reserves, First Nation reserves, indigenous territory, Aboriginal lands. So there's a lot of terms for these things, but we're really talking about, this is not an Aboriginal mapping exercise. So looking into OpenStreetMap, trying to figure out what is actually going on here with these tags. What are these features that are already in there? One of the things you first have to start doing is figure out what is actually being used in OpenStreetMap. So there's this tool called Overpass Turbo, where you can do queries that are basically like a database query that says, show me all the things in OpenStreetMap that have these tags. And these tags are key value pairs. They're basically attributes that are attached to a feature. And anyone can create a new tag. Anyone can just like start using it. It's totally a free-for-all, basically. And I found that there's two kind of main ways of tagging things that people were already using. Some people, especially in places like Brazil, were using boundary equals protected area, and then they were using this additional tag, protect class equals 24, which comes from some, I don't know, UN document or something that is like a class of protected area. But then there's also people mostly in Canada who were using boundary equals Aboriginal lands. Seems like either of these are potentially legit tags that we could use. And I also went digging around into the OpenStreetMap Wiki. So this is separate from Wikipedia. It's using wiki software, and this is kind of where all the collected knowledge of OpenStreetMap lives. And I found that already somebody had been doing work there. There was a proposed tag for boundary equals Aboriginal lands. It was proposed in 2010, but the person who proposed it later left OpenStreetMap and didn't really follow up with bringing that proposal to an actual discussion and any kind of meaningful approval within the community. And I should also clarify that even though I said it's a free-for-all, there are sort of rules in OpenStreetMap. There are certainly consensus on, well, this is the right way to tag something. We can't really stop you from adding any tags you want, but if you create your own tags and put it into OpenStreetMap, no one else will know how to use those or interpret them. So there is definitely consensus. There are some tags that have been voted on by the community, and they're said, like, this is the official way of doing things. And so one of the ways that you get a tag approved is you write up a description of it in the wiki, you send an email to the OpenStreetMap mailing list saying, I think this is a good idea, here's why, anyone have concerns, let's talk this out, and like eventually we'll vote on it. So basically I just found this proposal that already existed and just needed a bit of a nudge. And we had a nice long discussion on the mailing list and on the wiki. Mostly people were in favor. Some people had comments on like, maybe this other tag might work. Have we thought about this other thing? There were very few people who were just completely against the idea, although some thought this really should just be treated as any other kind of administrative boundary. And even people who identified as native in this discussion had different opinions. There's definitely no single voice that we could be looking to say, like, here's the way that it ought to be done. So one person who said that they're Cherokee wanted it to just be, find some way to fit this into the administrative categories rather than its own tag. Although then he clarified that the main reason he was concerned about that is in the past, people had tried this in OpenStreetMap and they just colored native reservations just like a natural preserve or a zoo. Like, that's obviously a concern. And in his point of view, he'd rather not be colored with any special color at all if it's going to be the same as using it as a zoo or a nature preserve. And then here's a contributor from the Creek Nation who was saying that, well, actually, it's even more complicated. We need probably like 3 different tags. The good thing with OpenStreetMap is that we can always add more detail later. So after the voting kind of happened, we basically decided we're going to go with this, we're going to approve this tag, the boundary Aboriginal lands, which people had already been using in OpenStreetMap for 8 years or more, but now it's approved. And it can be used in parallel with that protect class 24 if people wanted to use that in their own countries. So the consensus is basically we'll have these 2 synonymous tags to describe the same thing, but at least they're all sort of approved. So now that we've got it approved and we can get it on the map, we'll start talking about that in a moment in OpenStreetMap, but I wanted to come back again to thinking about, okay, what are these things that we're mapping? Why are they important? So here in the Puget Sound area along the Salish Sea, there were 2 main treaties between the settlers, between the United States, the territory of Washington State, and the native tribes in the area. The Treaty of Medicine Creek, which was near present-day Olympia, which was also the treaty that was with the Puyallup tribe that lived in these lands. And then for most of the northern part of the Salish Sea, including Bellingham, where I live, and including Seattle, there was the Treaty of Point Elliott. Why are these important? I mean, these are basically the founding documents that make the life of most of us who are in some ways settlers here, that make our lives possible on this land. These are at least as important as the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, but we are not taught these things. I grew up in this area. No one ever talked about. There's this treaty that was with us and with the Native people as equals, as sovereign nations, and that is why we're allowed to be here. Now, of course, these treaties were made under threats of violence. They were between completely different cultures who had different concepts of what territory and land is. They probably weren't even correctly translated. Taking all into account, and of course, even if all of those things had been met, then the settler culture was not really following up on their obligations in these treaties after them. So there's so many things that are wrong and flawed in these treaties. But if we want to have any baseline of how do we begin having real mutual relations with our native neighbors, how do we begin having any kind of ethical life here as settlers, the bare minimum is to understand these treaties, respect them, and to try to follow them, at least as best we can. And newsflash, it's not just these treaties were oh, now we get your land. There were obligations for the settlers too, including the native people were allowed to continue to fish and hunt in all of their territory originally, and that the United States was responsible for supporting the welfare of these reservations and the people living on them. And these treaties are still relevant today. The Lummi Nation, who was the one next door to Bellingham, recently was able to use their treaty rights to stop a new coal export terminal. So in a way that all the environmentalists of settler culture had no legal basis to actually stop this, this kind of climate crime of exporting more coal outside of the United States, the treaties that were still in force from the Lummi were able to stop it. Okay, so going back to OpenStreetMap, people are already adding these things in OpenStreetMap. We now have officially approved that tag. So now we can go to the maintainers of the OpenStreetMap map style and try to get these to show up on the map. In OpenStreetMap, that base map style that they use is they're not really trying to invent anything new. They're as much as possible trying to look at existing cartographic conventions. And so one of the things that we started working on, these are some photos from Paul Norman, who's a pretty active OpenStreetMap contributor. He started taking pictures of all these atlases he had. What are the ways that reservations are already being shown on print atlases? And reservations are a tricky thing because when you zoom out, you want them to be colored as a large color field across the landscape. But when you zoom in, you don't want a color field to be distracting from roads and buildings and streets. Really, once you get into very, very close in scales, you basically just want to see a boundary. You don't want to see a fill. So we tried to replicate that in OpenStreetMap. And it was actually quite easy. We did just kind of copy the existing styles that were being used for nature reserves and for national parks, but give them their own color and give them their own adjusted style so it's completely clear that these are not nature reserves. But most of the styling already exists in there. All right, so if you want to do any collaborative cartography with OpenStreetMap, you kind of have to get a little bit familiar with GitHub, which is the code repository where the style lives. It's not too scary, but there's a lot of files in there. Go ahead and dive in. In order to actually make changes and collaborate, you need to download your own extract of part of the OpenStreetMap world. The whole database for the entire planet is a little bit too big to work with. I started with just downloading Washington State. It's a bit of a learning curve, but there's this software called Docker, which you can run on your own computer, and then it basically does most of the work for you, makes a whole copy of the whole rendering infrastructure for OpenStreetMap, and then you can just change a single line of code and see what would happen. We use Carto CSS, which is like CSS style sheets for the web, but for cartography. The reports of the death of Carto CSS have been exaggerated. It is still in use. And this is a little bit of the code that makes these protected areas possible and turns them into, uses a variable for an Aboriginal color that we just can apply, so we can adjust how it shows up. Once we make that change and we test it in our own computer and we say this looks good, we create a pull request saying, here are the lines that I want to change. Does this look okay? Other people who are contributors will look at it and decide if that's safe to pull in. And all of this is stuff that there are a ton of very helpful other developers and cartographers in the OpenStreetMap style. If you're looking to do this yourself, they will be very helpful, but they won't do anything for you. So it'll be like, here's a change, and they'll say like, it could be like a one-line change that they could easily fix for you, but they're like, can you change this and then resubmit? Which is great. It's like kind of a collective learning experience as well. But they're very helpful. They'll answer any questions, but you kind of have to like push it along yourself. But we, of course, luckily people were checking the style, and of course, yes, we have the problem that there already were zoos that were using the same color that we decided we wanted to do. So we realized we're about to do exactly what we were told not to do, is to style these looking like zoos and theme parks. So our pull request, we paused for a little while. There was other work going on in the OpenStreetMap style to change some other colors around, and we waited until they were already working to change the color of zoos and theme parks. They ended up changing to purple, freeing up the brown that we wanted for the Indian reservations. And so there's a lot of like moving pieces when you're collectively creating a style where a lot of different people are working on different parts of it. But yeah, now these reservations are on the map. There's the Lummi in my neighborhood. Here are some on the border of Montana and Alberta, or in Oregon. Here's some in the Amazon of Brazil, where they were kind of incorrectly using nature preserve tags, and now we were able to like surface the correct tags that were hidden in there and color them differently from these biosphere reserves are separate from the indigenous reserves. And now we get to reveal why mapping native reservations is a bit of a challenge, and why a lot of cartographers would prefer to avoid the problem, and probably why we had not actually gotten these onto the map before. So here's the Puyallup Reservation, which is the one right across the harbor, in fact, including most of Tacoma Harbor. For any of you who live in this area, you may be surprised at the extent of this reservation. Like, this is basically covering mostly suburbia. Most of the land in this reservation had been bought up by non-natives over the last 100, 150 years. It's barely noticeable as a reservation on the ground anymore. And the Puyallup Reservation is large enough to shade in, but typically is left off maps. So you may find lots of maps of Washington State where they'll map every other reservation, but this is one, they're like, it's a little too complicated, a little bit too much mixed up in an urban area, and so they ignore it. So OpenStreetMap is showing that it actually exists, showing, all right, we got to deal with this thing. It's real. It's there. It's meaningful. This is a treaty we have to uphold. Things get even more complicated in some areas. So this is the Agua Caliente Reservation in Palm Springs, and it is some of these patchwork territories, like when they were giving out land to the railroads. They gave all of these other parcels to the native reservations, and that became extremely valuable land. For any of you who are in the DC area in the next few months, there's a really great exhibit at the Museum of the American Indian, the Smithsonian, specifically about this reservation and the decades of legal conflict of the natives there trying to not be forced off their own land. And OpenStreetMap now shows that actually more than half of Oklahoma is technically still a native reservation, and there's an ongoing case at the Supreme Court. Most of this land is not being treated as a native reserve, but still these treaties are in force. What is going to happen, we'll see. So that's where we're at now. We now see the native reservations on the map. Hopefully, maybe I've given you a little bit of sense of what it would be like if you see other things that you would like to add to OpenStreetMap. How would you start to wade into collaborating with other people on that style, or how would you propose adding things to the map that aren't there? And of course, find out the native land that you're on. The map native-land.ca is great for that. Find out what the treaties are in your territory, or if you're from Canada or the British Columbia, there may not be treaties in place. That process is still going on, but find that out. And thank you, and thanks to everybody in OpenStreetMap who helped with this and who had done that work before me, and I just kind of pulled a lot of it together. Thank you.